If you hide your sadness so other people don't worry, there's a deeper reason you learn to do that. Some people learn to carry their sadness carefully, not because it is small, but because they believe it should not touch anyone else. They become skilled at softening their voice when pain rises, at changing the subject, at offering reassurance while their own chest feels heavy. To the outside world, they appear composed, supportive, emotionally steady. But beneath that steadiness is a constant calculation. How much of this can be shown? How much would be too much? They sense that sadness has weight, that emotions can spill. And long ago, they decided it was safer to contain it. So they protect others by protecting the atmosphere. They smile through difficulty. They show strength when they feel fragile. They carry their sorrow quietly, believing this is kindness. This pattern does not come from emotional distance. It comes from deep awareness, from sensitivity sharpened by experience. They know how easily moods spread, how silence can make rooms uncomfortable, how vulnerability can change the balance of relationship. And so they become guardians of harmony, of other people's comfort. This is not the absence of sadness. It is the careful management of it. And over time, that carefulness becomes a way of being. Some people do not hide their sadness because they are unaware of it. They hide it because they notice its impact. They sense how emotions travel quietly between people, how a lowered tone can change a room, how heaviness can settle into conversations without being invited. So early on, they learn to soften themselves. When sadness appears, it is quickly translated into calm, into reassurance, into a version that feels easier for others to hold. This instinct often feels natural rather than chosen, a reflex more than a decision. The body learns it before the mind has language for it. They become skilled at emotional management, at timing their feelings carefully, at checking whether there is space for their pain before allowing it to surface. Most of the time, they decide there isn't. Instead, they offer steadiness. They show up composed, attentive, present. They listen more than they speak. They ask how others are doing, even when their own inner world feels fragile. From the outside, this can look like strength, like maturity, like emotional intelligence, and in many ways it is. But beneath that calm surface is a constant calculation. Will this sadness make things harder? Will it worry someone? Will it change how they are seen? So the sadness is held back, not denied but contained, processed privately, carried quietly. Over time, this pattern becomes part of identity. They are the one who cope, the one who doesn't make things heavy, the one who stays functional even when something hurt. What often goes unnoticed is that this instinct is not rooted in emotional absence. It is rooted in care, a deep sensitivity to others, a belief that love is preserved by minimizing impact, that protecting others from sadness is a way of protecting connection itself. And in the beginning, it works. This instinct rarely appears without context. It is learned, often quietly, often early. In some environments, sadness does not feel dangerous, but it feels inconvenient. It interrupts routines. It worries adults. It changes the emotional climate of a space that values stability. A child notices this before anyone explains it. They see how expressions of pain are met with tension, dismissal, or quick solutions. They learn which emotions receive comfort and which ones create distance. So they adapt. They discover that being okay keeps things smooth, that minimizing their feelings keeps others relaxed, that emotional restraint earns approval, gratitude, or relief. This learning is rarely explicit. No one says, "Do not be sad." But the message is absorbed anyway. Sadness becomes something to manage internally, something to postpone, something to carry alone until it feels safer. For some, this pattern forms in families where caregivers were overwhelmed themselves. For others, it appears in environments where strength was praised more than honesty, where resilience was valued, but vulnerability had no clear place. In these spaces, being low maintenance becomes a form of belonging. The child learns to read the room with precision, to sense emotional capacity in others, to decide quickly and quietly whether there is room for their inner world. Often there isn't, so they become self-contained, emotionally efficient, careful. This does not mean they stop feeling. It means they stop expecting space. As adulthood arrives, the pattern remains. They are praised for being easy, strong, independent, and the habit of protecting others from their sadness is reinforced. What began as adaptation becomes identity. They do not think of themselves as withholding. They think of themselves as considerate, and in many ways they are. But this early learning plants a subtle belief that their sadness is something to be managed alone, that emotional needs should not ripple outward, a belief that feels protective, and later, quietly isolating. The habit of holding sadness quietly is more than habit. It is a reflection of how the nervous system adapts to social and relational realities. People who protect others from their sadness often have heightened sensitivity to emotional cues. They notice shifts in tone, posture, and facial expression before anyone speaks. Their nervous system is alert, not to threat in the immediate sense, but to the potential emotional ripple their own feelings might create. Psychology calls this a form of emotional regulation. It is the ability to manage one's own internal state in order to maintain relational harmony. In some attachment styles, particularly anxious avoidant or caregiving-oriented patterns, regulating personal distress becomes an automatic response. The brain learns that expressing sadness can lead to tension, withdrawal, or discomfort in others, so it signals caution. This internalized monitoring often feels effortless, yet it is cognitively and physically demanding. Each moment of self-restraint involves subtle assessment. Is this too much? Will this upset them? Should I wait? The body responds with gentle tension, tightened chest, held breath, or a quiet suppression of tears. Empathy drives this containment. The desire to shield others is genuine. It is not indifference, but attunement. The person learns to prioritize collective emotional balance over individual expression. Over time, this pattern becomes encoded. Sadness is not denied. It is compartmentalized, processed privately, often through reflection, journaling, or quiet solitude. Yet, while this skill is adaptive, it carries cost. The nervous system remains subtly vigilant. Emotional energy is expended constantly in monitoring and containment. Connection is maintained, but intimacy is filtered. Sadness is present, but only in carefully measured doses. In essence, the psychology of emotional containment is a delicate balance. Preserving harmony, expressing care, and managing vulnerability, all at once, quietly, beneath awareness. Carrying sadness quietly is a quiet strength, but strength is never without weight. For people who protect others from their own sorrow, the effort to remain composed becomes constant. Each moment of restraint requires attention, subtle adjustments, and mental energy. They monitor their voice, gestures, and facial expressions. They assess the emotional capacity of those around them. Over time, this vigilance becomes second nature, invisible to others yet deeply felt internally. This strength often earns praise. They are admired for resilience, for being reliable, for carrying themselves without burdening anyone else. And yet, admiration does not soften the loneliness. The protective effort can isolate. The very people they care for may never see the depth beneath the calm surface. Sadness, contained, grows quietly, sometimes unnoticed even by the person who carries it. The cost is cumulative. Emotional fatigue settles in the body. A tightened chest, restless sleep, subtle tension in everyday movement. Decisions are filtered through the lens of others' comfort. The self becomes a careful negotiator, balancing what is felt with what is safe to show. There is also a quiet conflict. Part of them longs for acknowledgement, for permission to be human without apology. Another part believes exposure will disrupt, harm, or burden. The push and pull between desire and restraint creates tension that persists silently. And yet, they continue. Strength, in this context, is survival and love intertwined. It protects relationships but sacrifices ease. It is noble, yet quietly exhausting. In this pattern, strength and solitude are inseparable. The cost is subtle but real. The deeper the care for others, the more carefully one must hide one's own pain. And sometimes, even love feels like a weight when it must always be carried alone. Over time, the very instinct to shield others from sadness can create distance. It begins subtly. Conversations feel lighter, laughter easier, but the emotional weight of the unshared remains. The person is present, attentive, and dependable, yet a quiet space grows between them and those they care for. Others notice composure but not the undercurrent of feeling. They see reliability but not vulnerability. They see strength but not the moments of quiet despair carefully tucked away. The protective shell, intended to preserve closeness, gradually becomes a barrier. This distance is not born of indifference. It is born of care that has learned restraint. Every interaction is measured to prevent discomfort. Over time, protecting others' emotional landscape can lead to protecting themselves from exposure as well. Sharing sadness feels risky, even with people who would welcome it. There is a growing awareness. The very thing that keeps connection stable can also prevent intimacy. The realization often emerges through exhaustion, moments of longing, or the subtle ache of being unseen. They may recognize that while they have preserved harmony, they have also preserved separation. The paradox is painful. By containing sadness, they maintain relationships, yet the heart feels quietly isolated. Their presence is constant, but the depth of feeling remains private. Emotional closeness is experienced vicariously, in observation, rather than fully shared. And so, the pattern continues. Protection sustains connection but limits it. It is a delicate balance. Care without collapse, presence without exposure. Awareness of this distance is the first step toward reconsidering what it means to protect others, and whether true closeness might require letting the walls soften just enough to allow vulnerability in. Healing begins not with dramatic confessions, but with small, quiet allowances. For people who have spent years protecting others from their sadness, the first step is noticing it without judgment. Feeling does not have to be hidden. Tears can exist without destabilizing the room. A sigh can be taken without apology. The body can release tension without fear of causing discomfort. This process is gradual. They start by acknowledging inner heaviness in private moments, alone in a room, walking in nature, or in the quiet before sleep. The recognition that sadness is natural, human, and worthy of presence begins to soften the habitual restraint. Sharing becomes less about performance and more about honesty. It is not dramatic, nor is it demanding. A quiet statement, a gentle admission, a moment of stillness alongside another is enough. Others often respond with care, with listening, without judgment. And slowly, the person learns that allowing sadness does not burden, it humanizes. The nervous system, trained for caution, begins to relax. The tension of perpetual self-monitoring diminishes. Emotional energy once spent on restraint is redirected to presence and connection. The mind begins to understand that vulnerability can coexist with stability. Over time, letting sadness be human reshapes relationship. It deepens intimacy, fosters empathy, and softens walls that were once rigid. Protective instinct is still present, but it no longer dominates. They discover that caring for others can include caring for themselves, that presence is not lost in honesty, and that shared feeling strengthens rather than diminishes connection. In this quiet integration, Sadness is no longer a private burden. It becomes a bridge between self and others, between heart and mind, between solitude and shared humanity. True care does not demand self-erasure. It does not require hiding grief, discomfort, or vulnerability to preserve another's comfort. For those who have long protected others from their sadness, this realization is subtle but profound. Care can exist alongside honesty. It can hold space for both the self and the other. Sharing does not weaken connection, it enriches it. The moments once thought too heavy to show can now be met with gentle presence, patience, and empathy. Others are often more resilient than we assume. They can witness sadness without being overwhelmed, respond with compassion rather than judgment, and allow intimacy to deepen naturally. This understanding reframes protection. It is no longer about containment or restraint alone. It becomes about balance. It becomes about choosing when to share, not out of fear, but out of care. Boundaries still exist, but they are informed by self-respect rather than avoidance. The walls soften, allowing light to pass through without collapsing entirely. For some, this shift is gradual. A quiet word here, a shared tear there. Over time, the nervous system relaxes. Vigilance is still present, but it no longer dominates perception. Emotional presence becomes sustainable enough to allow closeness without anxiety, to allow honesty without guilt. In this way, protecting others transforms. It no longer requires hiding the self. It becomes an offering, a way to show that care can be honest, steady, and humane. Sadness can be shared, not as a burden, but as truth. Ultimately, the softening of protection reveals a deeper lesson. Love and care are not measures of what is withheld, but of what can be held together. The heart learns that by allowing space for human feeling, connection becomes fuller, gentler, and more enduring.